Now that we're done with spawning AI, we can move on to triggers. Triggers are used for all kinds of stuff. You can use triggers to end the mission. You can use triggers to, I don't know, make checkpoints that you need to hold for a certain amount of time. You can do whatever you want. You can use triggers to spawn AI programmatically without them spawning right at the start of the mission, but instead creating them, for example, when the player enters a certain area, etc. I mean, triggers are one of the most important tools when making missions. So we're going to see how to make a simple trigger, how to activate it, how to make it react to collisions or overlaps, and how to filter out unneeded, unnecessary overlaps. Triggers are over here. Pull it down from this list and drop it somewhere, and it will create the actor, the shape. Now, several things to keep in mind about triggers. First, it will serve you well to give it a tag, something unique that you can check against. You can set actor tags by clicking on these buttons and giving it a tag. For example, my trigger or something. Second, the team ID is very important because this determines when the trigger activates. Currently, triggers are set up in a way that they only activate if a character walks into them. And characters have teams. By default, as you remember, AI has the team ID of 100 or 100. Every time those guys enter the trigger, I will get the activation event and can react to it in the script. For example, 1 team ID for blue 4 teams. But you have to set it up separately. So if you want to have the trigger work out of the box and react to every interaction, you place 255 in this box. 255 is the generic team ID, which encompasses all actors on the map, all characters present on the map. So for now, we can just keep it at 255 and see how it works. And we can check it by outputting something to the logs. For example, I could try and output a message every time someone enters this trigger area. Over here in the logs, I will be scanning for my messages related to my trigger events. To get the trigger events even going, we need to write the event itself, because by default, it's not in this file. We need to get it into this file and set it up properly. For that, we again go into any game mode that's already present in the game and look for the overlap event handler. And here it is, on game trigger begin overlap. If we copy and paste this thing into our mission file on the left side here, we will get overlaps registered by the trigger if all of the conditions are met. So let's see what those conditions are. First of all, paste it here, change game mode. My game mode is called differently, so I have to make sure it's called the same way. This print message will be very useful. It will tell us when something enters the trigger. We can even see what exactly enters it. Everything else is currently extra. We don't really need it for now. If I want to see who enters the trigger, I can use this variable called character. What character enters the trigger? And to do that, we need a string representation of this class, of this variable. To get that, we just go use actor, use toString, and pass the character variable as the argument. Doing that will ensure that every time something enters the trigger, I will see the event in the log. Let's see if something happens. Editing mode. And as you can see, the AI is already entering and exiting the trigger. But if we look at the logs, we won't see any messages there. Here are the logs. Log world is basically where the mission starts to load. As you can see, you don't have anything related to scripts. We're looking for Lua mentions in the logs. So in order to fix that, we need to activate the trigger. And you activate it using several methods. First of all, you can activate all triggers on the map. Secondly, you can do it activating this particular trigger. And we do that using the setActive function. As you can see, it's in the actor namespace. The first argument has to be the actor you're about to activate, and the second argument is whether you want to activate it or not. For our purposes, just using this one line will do. So right after we spawn the AI, or maybe even before that, we need to set it to active, but we need to figure out how the actor is called. For that, we need to search the existing code for anything relating to triggers. Let's do a quick search, GB game trigger, and there you go. You can use this class to get all of the triggers on your map. Or you could try and get the actor with the exact tag. Let's just copy this thing. Place it here. Change it to my trigger, since that's the tag I set for that thing. And we'll leave that be. So we're looking for all of the objects of the class GBGameTrigger, and specifically the ones that have the tag myTrigger. And we need to make a variable that will store it. So we call it triggers. We can use this variable to iterate over all of the triggers, but since there's only one of them, I can just place this variable that holds a list of triggers. And using the square brackets operator, which is just the random access operator from C++ or whatever, you can access any element in this array. Since there's only one element, we put one here. This will be enough to set the trigger active. After that, it will respond to any overlaps with characters that have the same team ID as this trigger. In this case, 255 means any character will do. Let's see if the AI is already going around. They're already in the trigger, which means I should have the message in my logs. These are my logs. This is my map load, and you can see all the way down right here. We have what we need. Log Lua machine on game trigger begin overlap. That's my first print message from my file. It just confirms that the overlap event happened. And just to make sure you understand, the overlap event will happen for all triggers on the map. So if you want one specific trigger to react to certain events, it will still be caught by that same function. You'll have to use conditional operators. You will make conditions based on who exactly overlaps to make different triggers behave differently depending on the trigger tag and the actor that overlaps with the trigger. And you can get it by using the actor class that overlaps with it. For example, right here we have the BG mutant C. C stands for character, basically. It's the blueprint in the game that controls this particular class. So once it enters the trigger, we register the event, and that's it. Let's see if the same thing happens for the player character. I'm about to enter the trigger. As soon as I do, I expect to see messages in the log. I have a crap ton of overlaps. That when my character entered, it also activated the trigger. And you can even see my character's current ID in the mission. We can see that the trigger works for my character and for AI. Now let's see how to make it work only for my character and not AI. Now we'll change the trigger's team to 0. 0 is the default team your player character gets when he spawns in the mission. If you want to have a mission with several teams, you have to set them up separately. We'll do that next time. In the next video, we'll talk more about making multiplayer maps. First, we'll change this number to 0, making sure it only responds to my character and nobody else. Okay, so let's see. God mode just in case. Right about now, I should get the overlap. Okay, let's go take a look at the logs. As you can see, after the map spawned, I didn't have any trigger events until my character stepped into it, even though the AI was in the trigger when I exited the building, which means the trigger only reacts to anyone who's on team 0. That's exactly what we needed. Now let's see if we can do something fun with it, because triggers by themselves are nothing special. You have to attach some kind of logic to them to make the mission more dynamic, for example. Well, let's try and make this AI only spawn when I enter this trigger. For that, we need to go back to the mission file, take the AI spawn code, get back here, place it here. Basically, we're ready to go, but I don't want them to spawn just on any trigger overlap, correct? I need to make sure they're only spawning when they enter my trigger. And my trigger has a tag, so I can use that. I'll just copy this code for now. It's not very pretty, but we'll be conservative with making the code pretty once we're comfortable with scripting all of the logic in general. So for now, we just go into the trigger begin overlap. We can do the same thing. And we need to make sure that this particular trigger is the one we need. So if game trigger is equal to the first entity in the array, then we spawn the AI. In other cases, we don't do anything. For that, we use the if keyword. So exactly what we need to write. Game trigger equals triggers 1. If that happens, just grab this code and move it here. We should be good to go. And just to make sure, let's take this thing, copy it, paste it here to see if the overlap works or not in the log. Well, we'll see it anyway because the AI will either spawn or not. but just to make sure. We'll see if this string ends up in our logs after we do it. So let's move the AI away from this area. So get the spawner into this building, let's say. Why do we do that? Because we want the AI to spawn somewhere the player cannot see them. So it looks as if they were there all along. And you can use this trick to spawn AI programmatically during the mission. So for example, as soon as the player kills a bunch of AI and clears the first area, you wait for a trigger overlap. And once that happens, you spawn more AI, which means there won't be too many AI actors on the map all at the same time. But when you run out of AI, you can just spawn more. And you usually want to do that somewhere where the player cannot see, if you don't want to ruin the immersion of your players. So let's just spawn them in this small room right here. And let's move the trigger as well. Let's put the trigger where the player can enter this building, but right just about to enter. Like this. So if the player approaches one of the doors or the window, the AI will spawn in that area. I try to peek into the room. Let's try debug camera. So as you can see, nobody is there. So I'm standing right next to the trigger. And there you go. Quite interestingly, the trigger saw my overlap multiple times. So depending on how your trigger is set up, it will register overlaps over time, which probably means that you need to limit how many times your trigger fires off, depending on what you want to do. But we'll talk about that in the next video. This at least should get you going when you're designing a small single player mission for yourself.